It is my enormous pleasure to introduce Andy Kapsner and Hitoshi Omori, two of the, I think this isn't an exaggeration, two of the world-leading experts on connexive logic, talking to us about exactly that today. So I don't know how you're going to do the presentation, who's going to speak. So just whoever it is, take it away.
Thank you very much. I'll do the talking and Hitoshi will do the thinking. So probably any questions, I'll pass right on to him. I don't know, like the newscaster, just reading off the slides. All right. Well, thank you very much. It's quite an honor to be here. We're very happy to present this material to you. It's about connexivity. So it's called superconnexivity, but of course the connexivity is in there. And look at that. I'm trying to, yeah, here you go. And I will tell you what connexivity is in a second, so don't worry about that. I don't presuppose any knowledge of the topic. But what we're trying to do in the paper, and if anyone is at all interested in this, we're very happy to share our draft to get more information about the details here. But what we're trying to do is to pick up a very old idea, actually. I mean, it's an idea I had 10 years ago, so that's kind of the oldest ideas I have that are worth remembering, maybe. That is called superconnexivity, and it appears in a paper that came out in Thought, in the journal Thought, called strong connexivity. And strong connexivity is an idea that that people, you know, kind of picked up and engaged with. And again, I'll tell you what it is. That superconnexivity bit, not really. That kind of fell flat on its face for a reason that I kind of already realized, partly in the paper, but really it's turns out not to be a functional idea. And so there it lay 10 years on its face, and Hitoshi had the idea to maybe pick it up again and see if we can fix it. And we are trying to do that in this paper. And as it stands, it doesn't work, but we kind of try to make a slight adjustment to the idea. And what we come out with is something we call Super-bot-connexivity, for reasons that will become clear. Okay. Here's what I'm going to talk about. We'll introduce you to the basic ideas in connexive logic and strong connexivity, and this superconnexivity idea that didn't work for the reasons. In the next section, I will show you that it's simply trivial as soon as you start to assume the most basic of logical properties. So that doesn't work. And then I introduced that new idea that we have called super-bot-connexivity. And then I will compare it to some issues in philosophical logic. Among them, there's an interesting parallel to how intuitionists think about negation that is quite suggestive of some new ideas. And then section 5, maybe I will skip depending on time, but I will, yeah, maybe talk about it. Maybe I'll just scroll through the slides just to warn you, and I'll give a summary as well of why this was interesting, what you heard. Okay, so let's start with connexive logic. Connexive logic is a topic in non-classical logic that really has been around for arguably a long time. So it's characterized by these two sets of principles that are called Aristotle and Boethius. So arguably, you can find textual evidence in Aristotle's writings and in Boethius's text that they suitably interpreted and put into the vocabulary of propositional logic that they actually held these principles to be valid. And as I say on the slide, just because it's really cumbersome to talk about these kind of nested conditionals and read them out, it's not much fun. So I'll concentrate on the easier part, which is these two principles called Aristotle. And if you, I mean, we're completely putting aside that question now, whether it's historically accurate to talk about Aristotle in this connection. It's just the name of the thing. It's Aristotle, whether he held it or not. But if you look at it, and if you sort of think in terms of what does that mean in natural language in the way that we teach our first-year students, it kind of means, well, it's not the case that if A, then not A, right? And that arrow can be any kind of conditional, could be a counterfactual, could be indicative, maybe even causal. No matter what you choose from the standard interpretations of that, as a first impression, it really seems like this should be a law of logic to most people. So there are some empirical investigations. I didn't really do any proper testing of that, but when you present this to first-year students and have tried that, long list of things that they can pick and choose what should be valid in logic, like law of excluded middle, explosion, that thing, double negation, and so on. This actually comes out pretty much on top for most people. Most people coming into the course will say, well, that is surely right. I mean, that needs to be provable, if anything is, right? And then it turns out it's not valid in classical logic, that is. And that is puzzling to most people. But then you explain and so on why it isn't. And that is interesting in itself. So this is actually one of the few logics that are contra-classical in the sense that they are non-classical, but not because classical logic is proving too much. It's not like the case in the intuitionistic critique where they say, well, law of excluded middle, that's no good. You shouldn't be able to prove that. But this is a case where you say, well, classical logic is under-generating. This should be valid, and it's not. And I demand that it is, right? And it turns out that classical logic is post-complete. That is, if you add any new axioms that aren't valid anyway, then classical logic turns inconsistent and trivial. So basically, as a project in philosophical logic, much of the debate in connexive logic is, okay, we need to give up some stuff that that we have in classical logic, and which are the things that we can give up that hurt the least in order to get these principles into our system. So that's kind of the formal game here. But again, just to look at these principles and think, well, do they strike me as convincing, yes or no? Once you start thinking about, well, what happens if you have contradictions as instances of A? Well, things get mushy and so on. But just if you think of garden variety instances for A, today is Friday or something like that, that is really something that has a lot of intuitive force. And the intuitive force is just, well, today is Friday. If today is Friday, then today is not Friday. That just doesn't seem right, right? So what I observed was that as part of the interesting connexive logics that were developed recently, and I should maybe say it's kind of still a niche field, but over the last 20 years, starting with work by Heinrich Wansing, it's really picked up and gotten more and more attention. So, and also Hitoshi has been instrumental in putting that on the map. So there's really a healthy community now working on connexive logics. So there are now a number of proposals of how you can get these required validities. But what I observed in that old paper is that, well, yes, it's provable that, for example, Aristotle's thesis, not A or not A, that comes out as provable. But if you look at the semantics, you have instances where A arrow not A is actually valid or satisfiable in the semantics. So these are paraconsistent logics that won't explode, but they allow if A then not A to be true or to take a designated value. And I thought, well, that's really odd. I mean, given that your natural language intuitions are pushing you into this, I mean, there are other reasons to be interested in this, but I'm interested in natural language analysis and this very clear intuition that there's something here that needs to be acknowledged. If this is where you're coming from, then surely you want not just the validity of that, but also that A or not A should never be satisfied in your models. And that's basically all that strong connexivity is. So that's basically the topic of that old paper was just to say, well, if you're really coming from that motivation, then you shouldn't just have the validity of the negated thing, but you should also have these kind of, I call them unsatisfiability principles. So unset one corresponds to Aristotle's thesis that in no model A or not A is satisfiable. And that actually rules out very interesting, unfortunately, it rules out very interesting connexive logics. So that's a bit of a pity. Okay, but and again, I'm kind of skipping over. I'm happy to talk about it if you're interested, but I'm skipping over unset 2, which corresponds to Boethius, to this kind of nested conditional version. Just concentrating in the talk on Aristotle's thesis, and there the corresponding principle is unset 1. Now, one thing that is, that struck me even when I wrote the paper is that it's kind of a, I've always felt that it's kind of an awkward condition to put on a logic. It's very unusual to say, well, this and that shouldn't be satisfiable. And not have some other way of expressing that. So I was wondering, well, isn't there something more elegant that you can say here? And might it even be possible to push that thought in no model A or not A is satisfiable into the object language somehow? And that's basically the what I came up with back then, is this idea of superconnexivity. And what I looked at was the principle of explosion. And there's different ways to argue for explosion, but one is kind of sort of a normative story where you say, well, oh man, there's a negation missing here. Okay, that should not be A and A. That should be A and not A. Okay, so explosion is actually the principle A and not A, arrow B. So if you if you have a contradiction in your system, then if you have explosion and modus ponens, you're kind of drawing the conclusion that everything is true. And the normative story is here. That's kind of the punishment of bringing contradictions into the whole game here. If once you do that, well, things explode. That's the very colorful name that's stuck. Your machine breaks down. And you know, arguably, that is a mechanism that ensures the unsatisfiability of, again, A and not A. Okay. So how would that look if you apply it to this thesis that is attributed to Aristotle? My suggestion was to say, well, you just do the same thing parallel. You say A arrow not A, arrow B, and then the permutation with the negation here also. And if explosion works in that required way, that kind of should also ensure the unsatisfiability of A arrow not A. Now, unfortunately, that really doesn't work. Oh, look at that. Kind of a surprise slide here. That's just an illustration that the two things don't really go together in the sense that you have some strong connexive logics that don't satisfy super Aristotle. And one of them is this logic CC1, which is kind of famous in the connexive literature. It's due to Richard Angel and Storrs McCall. A many-valued logic with 4 values, 2 designated values, 1 and 2, and the truth tables you see here. And they have actually, Hitoshi and I looked into it, and we found more and more things to like about them. But intuitively, they aren't very attractive because you can't really find a good interpretation of the values. But what can be said about it in this context is it's connexive, and it is strongly connexive. So the unsatisfiability constraints both are met by CC1. But this super connexive thing is not valid. Okay. So it's not, you know, it's not the same thing, at least. That is clear already here. And the reason why they don't go together is because superconnexivity is really trivial once you assume modus ponens and substitutivity, which isn't really much to assume. I mean, most people are willing to really or will be unwilling to give up either modus ponens or substitutivity of logical equivalence. And this actually, I was kind of spitballing the idea, and then David Mackinson was pointing out immediately in conversation that that doesn't work because you can have an instance of this superconnexive axiom that immediately is provable, and it's a counterexample to that what you're trying to avoid, that has the form A arrow not A in the first line. And then so I said, oh no, okay. And I wrote my paper saying, well, that doesn't work. And then Hitoshi looked at it, took a second look at it and said, well, that's even worse. It's trivial because of the derivation that you see in the next two lines. It's really not hard, but I didn't see it. So really, what I said in the paper was, well, if that is something that you want to pursue, then who wants to give up modus ponens? There are these papers out there that give counterexamples, but not really. So probably you will have to give up substitutivity, and but just because there are more examples of logics that people take seriously that don't allow for substitutivity in unrestricted form. And I kind of left it there, and no one picked it up. So what we're trying to do is to take that idea and insist on substitutivity. I mean, that's kind of the driving ambition behind the project is to, well, and we do want to keep modus ponens. So modus ponens and substitutivity, we are not giving that up. How can we still kind of fulfill that that idea of superconnexivity in some way? And our idea is that whereas I used an arbitrary B, we introduce a bottom constant. And so that these, and then we call it super-bot, not super Aristotle anymore, but super-bot Aristotle now reads A, arrow not A, arrow bottom. Okay. And intuitively, you know, bottom is just really something bad that you don't want, you know, some can't think of a contradiction if you don't like contradictions, or, you know. But there are certain limits on logical properties that we can give bottom. So, oh, yeah, recalling, I didn't actually say that, but we're also assuming transitivity. And if we have that in place, we really can't have that bottom entails arbitrary formulas, right? Because then we're just back to where we started. So that is something that we aren't entitled to. And at this point, you might say, okay, so what is bottom then? If it doesn't entail arbitrary things, how, you know, it's something bad, but it's or something absurd, but it's not doing what we expect logical absurdities to do, because we expect that, you know, absurdity arrow A, that should really be provable, something like that. So then in the paper, we kind of rely a bit on things that Graham Priest has said in the literature, where he's saying, well, you don't really need that. There are sentences that are so uncomfortable that you really want to steer clear of them, and that is enough to deter you from any assumptions that will lead to them. So his example was, if you are forced to concede that you're a fried egg, then you will do anything to to spare you that embarrassment, and that's enough. You know, you don't need that you are a fried egg. Arrow A is provable. You know, that's, you know, that's a step further, but that fried egg business is bad enough already. You know, maybe that's enough. There's also there's an interesting, very old paper by Anderson, where he's doing some deontic logic, and that has a constant in it, and that is just the bad, basically. So if that and that action was taken, then something bad has been done, right? So maybe there's also a way to kind of draw from that, but it's kind of an uncomfortable mix between the object language and the meta language. So it should be, if A, arrow not A was assumed, then something logically bad happened, but it's kind of doesn't really work to my mind, but there's at least an interesting parallel also to that idea by Anderson. Okay. So one question is, well, if we just assume nothing about bottom, do we still have problems, or can we get some proof that this doesn't necessarily trivialize? And then the second question, because the answer will be yes, so it makes sense to ask a second question that will be, well, can we give some more logical oomph to that bottom constant? And even if we don't have the bottom arrow A valid, can we have that the bottom entails arbitrary A? So that's going to be our two topics for this section. first, a non-triviality result, as I announced. Yeah, it kind of works. You can add that Super-bot principle and the corresponding principle for Boethius to certain systems, and it will not trivialize. A sort of cheap proof of that is available if you take classical logic and interpret the arrow as biconditional. But that's not really yeah, as I say, that's a cheap shot. So we are now adding to our assumptions that the arrow is not biconditional. Assume modus ponens and substitutivity. And one example is that logic CC1 that I showed. And you'll probably have to take it on faith when I tell you that if you interpret bottom as something that always takes value 4, everything is fine and works out. And moreover, that's the answer to the second question. We find that bottom entails A. So that's not, that's maybe not everything that we would have expected from a logical absurdity, but at least it's something. So it makes us feel good. Now, one thing that we found very interesting is if you look at that Aristotle and then you juxtapose the Super-bot version to it, kind of there's something that happens, and that is that the negation that used to be on the left of the thing just moves over and becomes a arrow bottom. So that is very reminiscent of the way an intuitionist would think of negation. And just as a backstory there, this new wave of connexive logics that I talked about. By the way, something I should have mentioned is there's a very nice SEP entry on connexive logics. So if you need the background there, I highly recommend starting there. But that new wave really started with Heinrich Wansing talking about constructive connexivity. And so for him, 20 years ago, that seemed to be a very, very tight link between connexive ideas and constructive ideas. But the funny thing is that no one really looked at intuitionistic negation here, because Heinrich has worked on constructive negations that are different from the intuitionistic way of defining negation. So it's kind of he's working in these in the realm of Nelson logics with strong negation, if anyone has looked into that. So that was our intuition was, or our impression was, hey, this really looks like intuitionistic logic here in the sense that the negation is kind of transformed into that arrow bottom shape. And looking into it, no one really seems to have looked at intuitionistic ideas about negation and connexivity before. And we found that interesting and thought, well, maybe there are more insights to be gained here. The reason why no one really thought about intuitionistic negation and connexive logic is that it doesn't really work if you add Aristotle's thesis or Boethius' thesis to intuitionistic negation. I mean, that was something that was clear, because as soon as you have weakening on top of modus ponens and substitutivity, and you do have weakening in intuitionistic logic, you get something that is negation inconsistent, so that you can prove a formula and its negation. And the proof is not hard. It's due to Hitoshi, and so it's pretty I don't think I'll pass it out. Now, in intuitionistic logic, you do have explosions, so you have full-on triviality here. It might have struck you that this whole idea of kind of taking a bottom constant that isn't, as bad as other bottom constants, it's kind of an idea that sounds like minimal logic, but minimal logic will not be trivial, but we call it half trivial, because you can derive bottom at this point. Every negated formula will be provable once you add Aristotle's thesis to minimal logic, and that is bad enough. I mean, that's bad enough to make that logic pretty unusable. Okay. So here's something that again Hitoshi came up with, was a very clever reduction of the matrices of these of CC1, and actually we have a draft of a second paper on that logic and its properties, which are quite interesting in ways that I won't talk about, but I think, I mean, if anyone is really interested in that, we should hopefully have a draft that we can share sometime very soon. So again, drop us an email if that is piquing your interest. What happens here is that those 4 values of CC1 are reduced by kicking out value 2. Conjunction and disjunction really works nicely, but negation doesn't anymore. You need to fix that. But it's easy to define a new negation in this intuitionistic way as arrow bottom. And bottom is taken to be a statement that always takes value 4. Okay, so the red 4 in the negation column, that is basically the difference to the negation as we found it in CC1 in that row, and the 2 red values over there are just to draw your attention to the fact that we're still not dealing with a biconditional, though it's dangerously close to biconditional, maybe if you think about it that way, but it's not a biconditional. And in fact, it has very interesting properties if you're thinking about BCI, BCK kind of systems. It's somewhere in there, in between in strength, and really lots of interesting stuff that I really at this point would immediately hand over to Hitoshi, because he knows so much more about this. But if you're interested in these kind of logics, and then again, drop us a line or ask us, and I will have Hitoshi answer. So in this AM3, what we have is Aristotle's thesis. We can also show that the Super-bot Aristotle, that those 4 items there are basically the same thing, just in different ways of pulling and shoving on the accordion that is the negation that can be unfolded to an arrow bottom. So Super-bot Aristotle and Aristotle's thesis, they're just the same thing. You could also expand just the inner negation, you get the 3rd item, and if you expand everything, you get something that is actually an instance of supercontraction. So that's one point where those kind of discussions meet. Okay. That all is to show that it's perfectly possible to have Super-bot Aristotle in a system. Can also have Aristotle's thesis. You can have them together, and you can even find a way of looking at negation that identifies the two, so that if you're coming from a certain angle, then Super-bot Aristotle is not just natural, but it's just the same thing as Aristotle's thesis. Like I said, these are mostly interesting for people that are maybe a bit deeper in the discussion on connexive logics. There are more, well, I would say, secondary connexive principles that are sometimes assumed and sometimes not, that I would say are not really part of the core of connexivity as it is understood today, but that many people want. Again, this SEP entry gives a great overview here. And for all of them, you can kind of translate them into a Super-bot version. And we show in the paper that no big trouble really ensues. Right. Yeah, that last thing is is Aristotle's second thesis. It's kind of the idea that you cannot have if A then B, and if not A then B, and that is much more controversial than the other things. Okay. So let me conclude here. What we tried was to revive that idea of superconnexivity, and we're at least at a stage where we're confident in saying, well, there's something really interesting here that is worth exploring further. And really, we found many links to other fields that haven't really been touched by this discussion of connexive logic yet. So that is also one useful function that this consideration can take, maybe just to suggest further research in mapping those links. What we still, kind of have to flesh out more is the question: is that super-bot-connexivity really, at the end of the day, enough to do everything that these unsatisfiability requirements are asking for? So one problem that I haven't really mentioned here, but there's some if you're familiar with the Carnap's categoricity problem, there's some difficulties that need to be sorted out, and people, depending on their backstory, if they're, for example, proof theoretic semanticists, this might be a very thorny issue for them. But I haven't spelled that out in this talk. But if you know that discussion, then maybe it's clear where this is heading. We're still thinking about what to say here, really. And if you push us and say, well, what is this bottom really? We have, as I said, we have things that we picked up from other people and just kind of repeat. But maybe a fuller story of why this is really deserving the label of logical contradiction or logical absurdity. We need to kind of color in the picture a bit more. It seems to us that if you can, without too much cost, add that bottom entails everything, that is already a step towards an understanding of bottom as something logically absurd that is worthwhile having. That the next point is you know, we were motivated by this this concern with explosion and giving a backstory to explosion, and this new way of looking at connexivity actually invites a lot of interesting comparisons to explosion on the one hand, and on the other hand, you know, on the flip side of the coin, to paraconsistent and relevant logics. It's just an interesting fact that connexivity, as a, you know, sociologically speaking, the people who were interested in connexive logic over the last, you know, 80 years, or let's say, well, not 80, but you know, since let's say since entailment, the people who were interested in connexive logic were also the people who were interested in relevant logic. That's just a clear intersection between those two groups. No, the other way around. The people interested in connexive logic were also interested in relevant logic. Not, yeah, that's the way to say it. But there's really a lot of tension in this. And what we try to point out here actually looks like something that doesn't really go well with paraconsistency and therefore relevance. Because if you motivate super-bot-connexivity as we do, it's hard to avoid motivating explosion in the same way. And of course, there are formal constraints. What can you do to get one but not the other? And you know, those are interesting links that need to be spelled out in much more detail. And yeah, this view of negation as defined as arrow bottom, that really looks like something that will lead to a lot of interesting comparisons and new ideas. At least Hitoshi and I, as we've been talking about this, we have more ideas than to really find a way to cram into this draft, so it will spill out at some other point. But there's actually quite a lot of interesting things there, which we haven't yet developed to the point where we can present them. But yeah, we're quite excited, at least the two of us, about all of that. Okay, well, at that point, thank you very much for your attention and your invitation. And yeah, I'm happy to answer questions or pass them on, as I said, to Hitoshi. Thanks.